you take the predation issue and then factor it in with the habitat issues, you'll see that our landscape is much better for a predator than it is for a turkey. In a lot of our southern populations, we're never going to go back to where we were in the 90s. That's just not going to happen.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Vortex Nation podcast, and welcome to our 2025 State of the Turkey Union. We've got Dr. Mike Chamberlain joining us again. And Mike, man, welcome. This is one that we're excited about. We're incredibly passionate about turkeys and turkey hunting and turkey conservation here at Vortex. I know a lot of folks out there are as well, a lot of our listeners. And man, we are just stoked to have you here to talk about the state of the Wild Turkey Union, where things are at right now, trials and tribulations, things that turkeys are facing, how people who care about turkeys can help, research projects you've been working on, and stuff that you guys have going on at the Wild Turkey Lab. So that's a lot. I'm going to quit talking, and I know we covered a lot of this on our previous podcast, Mike. But if you can just give us a brief intro and a rundown on what you do regarding turkey conservation, a little bit of background there, and then we'll jump right in.
For sure. Yeah, it's good to be with you, Mark. So I'm Mike Chamberlain. I'm a researcher at the University of Georgia. I've been studying turkeys for about the last 31 years. I did my graduate work studying wild turkeys. And I've been in academics for, way too many years, I guess 25 years now, and have been conducting research on turkeys that entire time. So it's a species that's near and dear to my heart. And I'd say most of my current research is dominated by work on wild turkeys.
I mean, the wild turkey itself, and I'm sure we're going to touch on some things that we spoke about in the last podcast, but man, we're talking about an absolute, just one of the most phenomenal success stories that I've ever seen or actually, been able to witness in my lifetime. And it's crazy to think that in a lot of areas, though, traditional turkey strongholds, they're struggling. I mean, in my life, Mike, I saw turkeys in my home state of Washington go from novelty to nuisance for a lot of folks. I mean, they're like, oh yeah, we saw wild turkey, and you would never get permission to hunt there because it was just like, oh gosh, we have like one or two of these things. Oh no. And then all of a sudden people are like, yo, we got to get, like, there's too many, like they're in my backyard. They're creating issues. I mean, what is going on, Mike? What happened to the wild turkey in these places where they essentially, in some, and tell me if I'm being extreme, but went from boom to bust?
Yeah. No, I mean, what's happened is somewhat predictable in some ways, in that, we went through decades back in the 60s, 70s, 80s into the 90s where we were restoring turkeys to parts of their range and even beyond their native range. Populations were doing very, very well in strongholds such as the Southeast and the Eastern United States. Populations were exploding in the Midwest, and we were putting turkeys, like to your point, we were putting turkeys in areas where either they had never existed or were at low abundance, and everything was doing very well. And while that was ongoing in strongholds such as parts of the deep Southeast, turkey populations were already starting to decline a little bit, and we didn't realize it at the time. If you go back and look at the data that we've published, which has been widely shown, is we were seeing declines in the early 2000s in a lot of areas, but the declines from one year to the next were not obvious enough to portray an issue. It's when you stood back and looked at the data across 20 years that you started seeing that we were not making as many turkeys as we had been. Populations were slowly declining in many areas. And then if you fast forward to now, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, you've seen many states that have reported declines, whether it be a number of southern states, many states in the upper Midwest, a lot of states out in the central western United States, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and so a lot has changed, and to your point, now you have populations that are declining, you have some populations that are stable, and you have some populations that have skyrocketed, and turkeys are even a problem in some places, particularly if you go to some of the suburban and urban centers of the eastern and northeastern parts of the country. And so it really just speaks to the complexity of what it takes to kind of manage turkey populations across the US, because the issues that are facing turkeys, say in your neck of the woods, may be somewhat different than what's facing turkeys in my area. I will say one encouraging thing that I've seen over the past, say, 5-ish years is it does seem that some of the states that had been reporting pretty precipitous declines, it seems that those populations have stabilized, such as Arkansas, Louisiana, here in Georgia. If you look over the past few years, harvest has stabilized where it had been decreasing. And in some cases, like in Louisiana and Arkansas, harvest has started trending upward after, declining to a very low point. And that gives me, and I know managers in those states that I communicate with, it gives us optimism that maybe we've seen the low point, and now we're heading and trending back in the right direction, and hopefully that is the case.
So I've got two questions. Well, I'm going to have a ton of questions, but here's my two for right now. So in these states where we were actually, in some ways, unknowingly, or like you said, at least it just wasn't to the point where, sound the alarms, where we saw this slow but steady decline, did those populations hit is that just like a straight line, or did they actually hit a point of slow decline and then it kind of hit this critical state where it fell off, or is it just kind of that slow decline? What does that line look like?
Yeah, it's a very, very slow decline with year to year variation. So if you were to try to draw, it's not a line that's at a straight 45-degree decline. It's a very slow trickle down this year, this similar the following year, down a little bit the subsequent year, maybe up a little bit, down a little bit, but the trend is down and has been a very slow decline in most states. And some states have seen very little decline, and if they have seen declines, it's been minimal compared to, say, states like some of the states I mentioned. For instance, Arkansas is a state that's widely discussed because their population really seemed to plummet, and it was precipitous enough that it was obvious. It was obvious to the agency. It was obvious to people that hunt in Arkansas and have for much of their lives. So the rate of decline varies a lot in space.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, and you pointed this out, but this isn't everywhere, right? So there's probably some folks out there that are like, turkey declines, what the heck are you guys talking about? In these states where populations have experienced a decline but appear to have stabilized or on the increase, is that being attributed to anything? Is that state agencies, maybe decreasing tags or number of turkeys, that a person might be able to harvest during a season? Is it weather related? Is it all the things? What are we seeing there?
Well, I think what you're seeing is a combination of factors. I think one thing you're seeing is just a growing awareness that, to me, really exploded during COVID, when a lot of us were stuck and social media platforms exploded, podcast exploded in popularity, and we started communicating amongst ourselves more and realizing that some of the issues that we were seeing were also being seen elsewhere. We started getting information that we didn't have. We started gaining perspective that perhaps we didn't have. And I think what you've seen is just a much greater awareness in the turkey hunting community and also in the management community that we need to do something, that we can't be complacent. At the same time, you've obviously seen, I mean, yes, of course, weather variations and things, particularly as you move out west, have a substantive impact on turkey population productivity. If it's super dry, in Rio and Merriam's country, then productivity is low. If it's wetter and vegetation's more succulent and you get winter rains and good spring green up, then you typically have better production. And that's not really the case as you go out to the east, where things are a little more stable from a weather and rain perspective. But the other thing you've seen is just the reality that as populations declined and agencies realized that there were problems, they started making regulations changes. And yes, they're controversial and they're a political hot button, but that's just the reality that we live in. Agencies, when they perceive a problem, are going to pull the lever that they can pull at a statewide level, and that's harvest. And so you have seen agencies such as the agency, in Arkansas and Louisiana, here in Georgia, and many, many others that reduced harvest in hopes of carrying over more toms from one year to the next and keeping harvest more stable rather than allowing it to continue to decline at the rate it was declining. And so, yeah, in some of these states, once those regulations changes were made, you do typically see a predictable lag, right? So an agency makes a change, and if it's a substantive change, it still takes a little bit of time for you to see a signal in the data, but the signals are pretty clear in a number of states that now, to what I said a little earlier, you're seeing increased productivity in some states that have made changes to their regs. You're seeing harvest start to trend upward again, which is good, and hopefully that trend continues.
I mean, there's so many things that impact the wild turkey, impact production. I mean, everything out there wants to eat the wild turkey, including me. What challenges do just turkeys in general face on the landscape? Like, what is, like, whether an area is declining or not? Like, what are the things that impact the wild turkey?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I don't think any biologist or expert in the field would say anything other than number one is just habitat issues. This is a bird that lives its entire life outside of when it's resting at night or sleeping at night on the ground, and they make a living being able to see. And so this is a bird that lives in vegetation that it hopefully can walk through and see through. And if you look at the landscape in a lot of areas, the presence of those early successional vegetative communities have declined, right? So that's one issue. All you have to do is, I live here in Georgia. I'm an hour in a little change south of the Atlanta metro area, and all you have to do is get in a plane or drive around or get on Google Earth and start scanning back through time to see that you know our urban and suburban footprint is so dramatically higher than it was a few decades ago, and the result is a loss of habitat, a fragmentation of habitat with roads and rights of way and these things, and then a degradation of what's left out there. We don't manage our landscape the same way that we did 30 or 40 years ago. And whether it be changes in ownership, parcel sizes, larger parcels of land being split into smaller parcels that may not be managed, um, changes to how federal agencies are allowed or are able to manage their lands, constant litigation, constant red tape that they have to jump through to manage acreage that's public, and you put all that together, and it's a problem for turkeys, whether you're in the South where I'm at or to the Midwest where I travel a lot. Changes in farming practices. I mean, there are so many habitat, I kind of air quotes, habitat issues that face this bird, regardless of whether you live in a forested landscape or an agricultural landscape.
What about predation? Or from either just on live birds, nest predators. What's going on there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you said it. A lot of things will want to eat turkeys, including me. uh, you know, predator populations are fundamentally different than they were a few decades ago. If you look, there's been almost an entire collapse of the fur market. You know, trapping for fur bearer species is not nearly as common as it was a few decades ago, and many would argue that it's a lost art in many cases. Birds of prey, their populations have skyrocketed over the past few decades. So there's a lot of things out there that eat turkeys, and and yes, turkeys have dealt with predators forever. I mean, the reason that turkeys are so wary and in many ways so fun to hunt is because they're shaped by millennia of dealing with things that try to kill them and eat their eggs and their poults. But yeah, if you take the predation issue and then factor it in with the habitat issues, you'll see that in a lot of cases our landscape is much better for a predator than it is for a turkey. And that's unfortunate, but it's the reality that we live in. And some interesting stuff we've actually found recently. You mentioned, talking about some of the emerging research. We use GPS units, right? We capture birds and we put these little small GPS packs on their back, and they wear it like a backpack. And these GPS units track the birds constantly. So we're getting locations constantly on these birds. And recently, these companies have added accelerometers, triaxial accelerometers to the units. And so what we've been able to recently do, and we're actually going to present some of this work at the NWTF convention in a few weeks, is we can now very clearly see when a bird gets killed. It's a very clear signature on the accelerometer data. And what we've observed is that depending on the time of year and the sex, a lot of birds are being killed at night in the tree. A much,
Interesting.
yeah, a much greater percentage than I would have thought years ago. And most of that is great horned owls. Um, and the birds are dying. My prediction was that maybe these owls were killing turkeys right at daylight when they were starting to move around on the limb and gobble and yelp. But what we've actually seen is that's not the case. They pretty consistently kill them all night. So that tells me that great horned owls definitely perceive turkeys as a prey species. And interestingly enough, a lot of the kills that are occurring from owls are occurring during their reproductive season, which is just before when turkeys reproduce. So think, late winter, very early spring, we see a lot of mortality in the tree during that period.
Do you speculate they're transitioning from other prey species that are potentially less abundant at that time of year towards the end of winter? So they're like, or
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah, and they're rearing young at
okay.
that time. So I think it's all of that, Mark. It's one, I've got young that I need to feed. They're growing rapidly. And two, that's a tough time of year, for everything to obtain food. So I think it's kind of a perfect storm for turkeys. And so that's something that's really kind of opened my eyes to, we talk about predator management and trapping, and there is value in that in some situations, but this one finding causes me pause because it tells me, well, how do you mitigate that? You really can't. We don't manage raptor populations or owl populations. I know you do in the Pacific Northwest, but this idea of going and just managing great horned owls isn't something that's currently on the playing field. So that has been really interesting to me, and it kind of speaks to the complexity of how predation works. And to be honest with you, it was really shocking to me because you think when a turkey gets in a tree at night, they're pretty safe, right?
Yeah.
And that's why they roost off the ground, is to avoid things that run around on the ground and eat them. And I guess it just, you know, it tells me that there's really no safe time or place to be a turkey.
I mean, that's what immediately went through my mind when you said that. I'm like, man, these guys can't win. Like, I think of when a turkey would be vulnerable, and I'm like, okay, like you said, either gobbling on the limb, moving around, or you've flown down, and now, that's kind of where, in my mind, where the predators live that are going to, either get into a nest or, take down even an adult bird. And just their sanctuary, their saving grace. Mentally, I'm like, well, when they're in the tree, they're good to
Yeah.
go. Like, we made it, everybody. We made it another day. And holy mackerel, to be susceptible at night when you're sleeping. I mean, man,
And if you think about it, that's a critical time for them because their night vision is not very good, because of the way, and we don't have to go into weeds here, but because of the configuration of rods and cones in their eyes, they have exceptional vision and acuity during the day, but their nighttime vision is quite poor. And most turkey hunters probably can attest to this, if they've walked by birds in the dark, or they may hear you but they can't see you, type of thing. And so, yeah, I mean, it kind of stinks if you think about it. You're like, whew, made it through the day, and I climb in a tree and I'm going to settle down and everything's good, and then pow, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you can or can't answer it. Maybe it is or isn't being talked about. And I think of things like this as it relates to the wild turkey, other game bird, and possibly even like non-traditional game species populations. But, like I can be out west and you'll see a red-tailed hawk on seemingly every fence post, every power pole. I mean, the density is, significant to the where I'm like, man, is there even a mouse or a bird or anything within, 100 miles of this place, just because there's so many raptors. And not what we're talking about today, but I think of like, salmon and steelhead stocks in the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and actually even shellfish populations. We've got the Marine Mammal Act, but do we need to revisit some of these things that have been so wildly successful? Do we have too many raptors? Do we have too many seals and sea lions and otters that are predators of these other fish that are in trouble in some areas? And I guess let's stick to turkeys.
Are we a victim of our own success? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, what's going on there? Are there any talks about that, or are people thinking that we maybe need to revisit some of these things that, again, like an amazing success story, but
yeah, I honestly, I don't know if those conversations are being had or not. My job is to simply provide the information, and then, agencies act on it. When you start talking about these types of issues, as they're so contentious. There's so much, misinformation, disinformation. There's so much rhetoric when you start talking about, for instance, predators like wolves. And I mean, it just gets so politically charged and so contentious. But to your question, speaking personally, yes, this is something I think about. When I was a kid, um, and even as a teenager and a young adult, I don't remember. I can clearly remember um, the first time I think it was the first time I heard a great horned owl. I remember thinking to myself, I don't remember if I'd heard it in an audio tape or seen it on TV, or because go figure. I know it's going to come as a shock, but I was kind of a goober as a kid, and so I kind of, I read a lot, and I had a bunch of buddies and everything that I hung out with, but I read science a lot, and I tried to listen, watch science stuff on TV, and went to the library, and I remember hearing a great horned owl and thought that was so cool. And now I travel very few places where I don't hear a great horned owl at night. In fact, it's an interesting question. The other night, this was a couple of weeks ago, um, I was deer hunting on a property near my house, and as it started getting dark, from the stand I'm sitting in, I could hear three different groups of coyotes that were talking. I could hear two different horned owls that were calling, and I'm thinking to myself, there's a lot of risk, just what I am aware of, and I don't know what else is out there, but just from what I'm just in my hearing distance, if I'm an animal that's a prey species of any of these animals, I'm on high alert because there's a lot of risk in my environment right now. Um, and so, yeah, it is something I think about from a turkey's perspective.
I think these turkeys are dying of stress. They're
Well, and there's growing evidence of that as well. In fact, I have a student that has published some work on this, and is continuing to do this work. This notion that there's growing, possibility that predation risk, the predator may not kill you, but the stress of having to avoid them, to deal with them, is an indirect problem for you. And it's not just with turkeys. There's growing evidence in a number of species that the indirect pressures of predation could be as impactful as the direct pressures. Um, and that's interesting because, if you're, and anybody that's turkey hunted knows this, turkeys are constantly aware of their environment. They're already wired, high strung. And so they're constantly on the lookout for danger. Well, every time a bird has to be vigilant, they can't be putting a piece of food in their mouth, right? And so there's these trade-offs, if you think about it through time, that if you're constantly having to be more vigilant, then you have to compromise somewhere else. You just have to. So yeah, I mean, I think there's growing potential that there could be these more subtle indirect effects of predators.
Yeah, I mean, and then you think, the more predators on the landscape, the more times in a day or year or however you want to look at it, that turkey's going to have to evade, a predator. And like you said, not only are you not feeding, but now you're fleeing, you're expending more energy than you otherwise would have had to. So, I mean, it's like, I picture it just being this compounding thing. And then you do that repeatedly over time, and you probably have a problem on your hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it adds up. It's cumulative. Yeah.
Golly. Well, what about, you touched on some of the research you've been doing. In fact, when we were first planning on doing this podcast, Mike, you're like, well, I can't next week because I'm out doing field research, which I think is so cool. So if we can, since the last time we talked, what projects have you been working on? What types of research have you been doing? Have we found out some additional new things that we haven't talked about yet today?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot going on. That's for sure. There's a lot of research going on across the U.S., and of course, I'm certainly not involved in all of it, but I do have my hands in a lot of different studies in a number of states, and gosh, there's so much we're learning. The accelerometer data, like I mentioned, is really interesting. We're starting to be able to see more about this bird's behavior and how complex it is than we've been able to do before, not just from the accelerometer data, but but the strength of the spatial data, how many just millions of locations that we obtain. One thing that is really opening my eyes is some of the genetics data. In fact, the monitors behind me, on one of those monitors, before I blackened it out, there's a manuscript looking at sex ratios of hatched eggs in population. So what we can do is we take the eggshell membrane, right, the membrane on the inside of the eggshell, and you can get maternal, paternal, and poult DNA out of that eggshell membrane. So we can see who the father is, who the mother is, and we can sex the poult that hatched from the egg. And what we're seeing is really eye-opening. For instance, we're seeing a really strong female bias. In other words, about almost 70% of poults on a bunch of our sites. Interestingly, all of these sites are hunted, are females. But when you look at the data from our non-hunted site, which is a 200,000 acre area in South Carolina, it's 50-50 male to female. That's really interesting. We don't understand exactly what's prompting that, but we have some suspicions. The other thing we're seeing is a really strong what's called a reproductive skew, and what that means is there's a really small percentage of toms that are producing a lot of clutches. And that's not surprising because we know that turkeys have dominance, right? We know that there's toms that are better than other toms, but it does appear from the genetics data that the same tom is if he lives, he's fertilizing a lot, if not all, of the clutches in his home range, which is really interesting. We're seeing instances of hens that have two toms, right? There's two toms in her clutch. That's very common. We even saw an instance where there were 7 toms represented in a clutch, which is really wild.
So that would mean she bred with 7 different toms then, and they just
at a minimum.
Okay.
Yeah, at a minimum. Most of the instances where there's more than one tom in a clutch, it's 2, right? She bred with one and then another, and both of them are represented equally in the clutch. We do also see instances where there's 2 hens that are breeding with the same tom, and so they're producing a bunch of half siblings, right? The 2 hens aren't related to each other, but they're producing offspring that all have the same dad. And so that data has really kind of opened our eyes. It has to me. It's just as to how complex their mating system is. This idea that turkeys just go out there and breed with whoever's standing there is nonsense. It's clearly much more complicated and nuanced, which is really cool to me. And so that data set has been really eye opening, to say the least.
Is there, it's interesting because I look at it 2 ways and I go, well, the most dominant, strongest bird gets to breed, and those are the genetics that you want to pass on. But then is there any risk to a lack of genetic diversity within, I guess the population of turkeys in that area?
Yes. And typically that's not a problem in a free ranging natural turkey population, even with these, even with the pronounced dominance hierarchies that they have, and the fact that you do see this, this skew that I just mentioned. If turkeys can move about freely and disperse, then you typically don't see any issues with genetic diversity. Those issues seem to pop up when your population gets low and you have pockets of birds that are isolated from one another. And we're studying one of those populations as well now that it appears is in a complete vacuum. The turkeys in that area one flock is not integrating with another flock. They're very segregated, if you will. And it's because in that case, it's because there's so much non-habitat between one group of birds and the other that they just can't move from one area to the next. And so you get a lack of genetic diversity there. But typically that's not really a big problem with turkeys.
Okay, gotcha. Going back to, and it sounds like we don't fully know, but these clutches on, hunted or heavily hunted areas with a ratio that shades, heavily to, creating more hens. Is it, I mean, to me, it seems like it'd be like magic, but can the turkey, or are we speculating at all that they can sense the carrying capacity and that we need more turkeys here, so we're gonna create more hens that can create more turkeys? Or like, can you speak to what you guys are speculating there? I find it kind of fascinating.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. The short answer is yes, there is evidence that females can adjust the sex of their embryo, and that's not just with turkeys, but in a number of species. There are quite a few explanations, and we don't know that any of these, but I'll offer you some possibilities. One is that there is quite a bit of research in birds in general showing that if the female is stressed when she enters the egg laying period, that she will disproportionately produce females, because females are the less energetically costly sex to produce. And if you kind of think about it, producing a male, if you're a turkey, producing a male embryo that is going to be strong, big, fit, that is more costly than producing a smaller embryo that maybe that's going to become a hen that, so in birds in general, if there is a skew, it often results from the female being stressed when she enters into egg laying. And I think that's a real possibility with turkeys in many populations because, like we've talked about, whether it's predation issues, a lack of foraging resources, maybe it's they're having to maintain larger home ranges to find resources. Maybe all of these things are kind of accumulating on them, and maybe they are stressed enough during that critical egg production period that it causes this skew. The other thing, which is a possibility, and it may get people really mad, and they may want to lynch me for saying it, but in a lot of our populations that I'm discussing the data from, that's when hunting starts. I mean, hunting starts right before the egg laying period in a lot of these populations. So, and I'm not saying it's a hunting problem. Maybe it's all of this stuff just kind of lumped on, like we've talked about. Maybe all of these things are just, not, no pun intended, but they're just pecking away a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, a little bit there. And the next thing you know, maybe that's enough of a stress to cause her physiologically to say, I need to produce the least costly sex. And therefore her body shifts to producing more females. I don't know if that's the answer, but it's plausible to me. It's certainly something we need to continue digging into. And there's some other, there's other things in the literature on other species about, maybe there is literature showing that if resources are really limited at times, like during winter, that you'll see females will shift the sex ratio of their embryos. I don't think that's a really good explanation for our data set, because most of our birds that I'm talking about are at southern latitudes. And, unlike with you, we don't really have, although it snowed yesterday for the second time this winter, it's only snowed 3 times here in 12 years since I've lived, 13 years since I lived here. And it's bitterly cold here. So, but outside of this year, usually like in my area, you don't see these nutritional stresses in winter. Birds don't really get stressed and have to deal with critically low temperatures and snow and these things that that would stress a bird at more northern latitudes. I will be curious to see there are some data being collected in more northern states. I hope those researchers are going to do the same analyses we've done. I hope they are. I will say it's costly. Um, and it takes a lot of effort to get that DNA out of that eggshell membrane. It's not simple. It takes diligence and it takes time and it takes people that are well trained and that listen and follow instructions, because the DNA extraction is not simple. So I hope those researchers that are collecting those comparable data will do the same thing, and maybe we'll see that, maybe in more northern areas it looks different. I don't know, but it to me it's really interesting pieces of information that kind of causes me to scratch my head.
Yeah, I mean that is super interesting. Where does funding for this type of research come from? Is that coming from license sales, other places, donations?
Yeah. Most of the research that you see funded, and when I say most, I mean the most of the actual dollars are coming from state agencies who are providing grants to universities. And a lot of that money, not all, but a lot of that is through Pittman Robertson funds. So yes, through the sale of hunting licenses and firearms and shooting equipment and that type of thing. That funds a lot of the work that people like me do. There are some states, as you very well know, that have like wild turkey stamps. They sell state stamps, and those stamp funds can go towards research. Of course, you have nonprofits like National Wild Turkey Federation that are contributing. They have a research budget every year that they contribute towards a number of projects. And I can't speak for all researchers, but at least in my case, yes, I do have donors that send monies. I literally have gotten checks from people that was $25, to $50,000. I mean, it just really depends, and every dollar is appreciated. So it takes an army, if you will, and it unfortunately, I think what you're going to see is in a few years. I don't know whether it's 2, 5, 8, whatever, but within the next handful of years, I think you're going to see a lot of these projects that are ongoing now end, and those states are going to move on and put funding towards other priorities, towards other research priorities. And at that point, and I've just talked about this, I gave a seminar a few weeks ago and talked a lot about this. When that happens, the research that we have that keeps sustaining itself is going to be critical to get us through and answer the questions that are facing us, because some of the states that are conducting research right now are not going to continue to do that. They're going to move on and put resources elsewhere, as they are often required to do. And so we're going to see this turkey bubble, if you will, pop at some point. It's happened before in my career, and interestingly enough, when it popped the last time is when these declines were ongoing, were early on, and there wasn't a lot of research out there that would have documented what was going on. And so I sincerely hope that the awareness that we've built up as a community, as a turkey hunting community, I hope that awareness and the passion for the bird will continue to permeate our ranks and will push us to encourage our agencies to keep putting resources towards this bird, to keep prioritizing research and land management in particular, to manage public and more importantly to me, private lands, to benefit turkeys and the other species that thrive in those same areas.
Yeah, I would say one thing that I think or feel that we have working in our favor in that regard is a lot of people who are alive right now who love turkeys, who have turkey hunted for a number of years, have watched this happen. And so you have that a very personal connection to it. And you've also seen, I guess, the curve go up and peak and come back down. And I think I even mentioned this on the podcast, but there was a time where, you know, you looked at a lot of states, and this was me personally, I'm like, hey, congratulations, we did it, everybody. We've restored the wild turkey. These populations are thriving. You couldn't even picture a world without just a ton of wild turkeys everywhere you wanted to go, liberal seasons, long season, whatever, what have you. And so a lot of us who have seen that realize, oh, wait a minute, we can step back and go, this can happen. The job kind of it's never done. We need to be we need to be vigilant on this. We need to keep our eye on it, even when times are good, which is a little bit harder to do, right? You can get complacent and you think, yeah, everything's honky dory until it isn't, and that's where we are in a lot of places right now.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think the newer cadre of younger turkey hunters, you know, that are being exposed to the sport now or within the past handful of years, you know, they evolved in the presence of us having these conversations. They're having them, they're hearing them, they're talking to their dad or their mentors who, you know, I can remember hunts where I literally in the eastern, southeastern United States couldn't figure out which direction to walk because there were turkeys everywhere around me. And I even can remember hunts where the inability to make a decision as to which turkey to go to on the limb caused me angst to the point where I had to stop and say, Mike, you've got to make a decision. Make a decision. You have 30 seconds. We are going to walk in one direction or the other quickly because you're standing here deliberating. And now, you know, if I go, and I do, if I go to those same places, if I hear a turkey gobble on the limb, he's probably going to be the only one I hear. And if I hear two or three, I'm stunned. And so I think there are enough people like me and like you that have experienced those days and see where we are in some places, not all places now, combined with the fact that you have a lot of hunters that are being recruited and they can't even relate to that. You know, what they see is what we're seeing now in a lot of populations. And I think if you put all that together and we don't take our foot off the gas, then we can avoid going down the same road we've been down, which I pray, you know, we certainly don't do that again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, and with people who have seen it, being able to relay, you know, like, I guess I am getting a little bit older because now I can talk about the good old days. But just, you know, what can we do collectively to get it back there, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't, you know, the reality is, Mark, in a lot of our southern populations, we're never going to go back to where we were in the 90s. That's just not going to happen because, you know, the landscape is so much different than it was back then. And, you know, for instance, I mentioned the Atlanta metro area. I mean, if you just take the last 20 years of growth and the footprint of Atlanta, and you factor that in, there are people that are modeling this. Atlanta is basically going to cut the state of Georgia in half. It's going to cut a swath from the Alabama line to the South Carolina line in a southwest to northeast direction. And that is not going to be turkey habitat any longer, right? And so when you start looking around the country we live in, the continent we live in on, we're not going back there. But I think what we have to do is prioritize this bird and be willing to, again, have conversations with agencies and nonprofits and politicians to prioritize this bird and where they live. And if we can do that and not let them slip in the priority list, then the future's bright. If we let ourselves become complacent like we have done before, then we may get smacked in the mouth like we have previously. And I hope we don't go there. And I don't think we will. I think there's enough awareness now that we don't want to repeat those same mistakes.
Well, and I'd have to think, Mike, by focusing on the turkey and things that impact it, like development, land use, and I'm not anti-development. I know where
Sure, sure.
I know where my house is. That used to be a cornfield, right?
Mm-hmm,
I'm well aware of that. Um, I'm sure a lot of other species benefit from that though as well. Yes.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And there's obvious benefits to managing habitats to benefit turkeys, because if turkeys are thriving, then there is a disturbed early successional vegetative community on the ground. It's open, there it's succulent, there's forbs and grasses and legumes, and there's things that a suite of species benefit from. So yes, there are ecosystem benefits, not just turkey benefits. The turkey is simply one bird that thrives in certain habitat types, but there are dozens and dozens of species that thrive in the same habitat types for the same reasons, whether it be they can see, there's forage, there's cover, whatever it is. The turkey's just kind of the sentinel, if you will. It's the bird we're talking about, but a lot of species benefit from managing for turkeys.
Yep. Any other interesting research that you've been doing or that you're aware of in the community that is of note, or things people might be interested in?
I would say, yeah, the genetic stuff, the accelerometer stuff is really cool. The other thing that we're now doing that, you know, people will listen to and say, well, what does that really tell us? Um, is two things. One is just that we we're collecting so much behavioral data that we can do very sophisticated analyses on how birds behave, right? How far they move, how fast they move, et cetera. And what we're clearly seeing is that there's a variety of personalities that this bird has. There are some birds that are very risky. They behave in a way that's very risky, whether it's how they move, how much area they use, how close they hang around roads and other areas that we use. And then there are some very, very shy birds. And I'm not just saying toms, this is both sexes. There are some turkeys that are very, very different in how they behave. They do not want to be around us. They do not want to hang around areas that we frequent, and they change their behavior when we're around. And that to me is kind of interesting, because it seems like I end up around toms that don't want to be around me all the time. I think that's the ones I disproportionately end up hunting. But so that's been really, really interesting. The other thing that we can now do, because of the kind of the technology that's out there, we can really understand how turkeys are responding to land management, whether it's prescribed burning or clear cutting or timber stand improvements, or you name it, anything that you're doing in your neck of the woods. The data that we collect now is so precise that we can really understand, if we do this, this is how they respond to it. Conversely, if we do this, this is how they respond to it. And you, we can collect so much data now that the level of precision is so much higher. In other words, what I'm saying is we have much less uncertainty in our inferences now. When we come up with a conclusion, if you're basing a conclusion on a few thousand locations that you took on turkeys versus 5 million or 10 million, there's a dramatic difference in the level of rigor there. And so what you're seeing now are these data sets that are so large that there's much less uncertainty in our conclusions. And the last thing I would be remiss in not mentioning this is that the other day when you when you contacted me and wanted to do that podcast, the reason I couldn't do that is because we were deploying GPS tags on toms, and these GPS tags are fitted with an audio device that records every time he gobbles.
Wow.
And so we've developed this in partnership with an international company. Um, we don't know if it's going to work the way we think it's going to work, but we're really optimistic based on our testing that each morning we will have a documentation of how many times he gobbles, if he gobbles at all. And if we can collect that information, then we can use the gobbling data that are being collected all over the country as we can back calculate how many toms are there are to produce that number of gobbles on the landscape. Does that make sense?
Okay. I think so. Yeah.
It's basically, if you so for each day, if let's just say if you have 100 birds and on day one all 100 gobble, on day two 82 gobble, and so each day you have the probability that an individual gobbler or tom is going to gobble. If you know that through time, mathematically you can create what's called a detection probability, the probability that he's going to open his mouth and let one out. Well, then if you know that, you can use the gobbling data we collect, which is we have these listening devices that are recording gobbles, right? Every time a gobble sounds out, we get it, we hear it, and we store it. If you know the probability that you're going to get a gobble from each individual, then you can back calculate as a proxy. The gobbling data will tell you within, from here to here, let's say from 80 to 120 birds. That's how many birds are on this study area. And if we can do that, we can start collecting real time information on how many toms are out there. And if we can do that, we could offer agencies a very powerful tool to understand how many birds are on some of these sites that are being managed or hunted or not hunted or whatever. That, if we can make it work, I think will be very powerful because it will allow us a level of precision in understanding abundance that we've never had. And the reality is we've never understood, we've never had an idea how many turkeys are out there. We have no clue whatsoever. And so this work I think will get us closer to being there, at least from males. And just the cool the cool data that will come from this, I think, is really interesting because you compare the individual gobbling activity with how he behaves.
Okay.
Right?
Sure. Like, is this turkey that gobbles a ton? Is he one of these quotation mark risky gobblers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Or is he not? Is he one of these guys that, are there some toms in our population that don't gobble? And if they do, they gobble very sparingly. And my hypothesis, based on my own observations, is yes. I think there are some toms that gobble very little, particularly once hunting pressure starts. And if they do gobble, they only do it in the tree. They do not gobble on the ground. And I think if we can demonstrate that and show that to the public, and also just see how variable is it? Like, are there some toms that don't gobble at all? And if there are, what percentage? Is
Sure.
it just a few? Is it a lot? And are there toms that only gobble, let's say, think about it this way. If you got a big sample of toms, are there some that don't gobble at all? And then are there some that only gobble maybe once or twice a day? And if they do they do that every day? Like, are they, do they behave the same day after day after day, or do they change a lot? Right? Are there some birds that gobble a lot and then they don't gobble at all? I don't know. But this would answer that.
And you may have already said this. Are you getting location data when they gobble as
Mm-hmm.
well?
Yes, we have the GPS is collecting data every 15 minutes on where he's at.
Yeah, because that would be really interesting to be like, oh, this turkey, he roosted here, he gobbled on the limb, he did turkey stuff all day, and then, but eventually, maybe he ends up in this specific spot when he doesn't have a hen or whatever, and rips off I don't know, like, yeah, like you said, like it's a lot of curious things, frankly, that I've never even thought about until you brought up being able to monitor it.
Yeah, I think we're really looking forward to seeing what comes of it because, and this is kind of the turkey hunting geek speaking, not as much as a scientist, but a lot of what I hope we'll learn from that interest me as a turkey hunter more so than a scientist. It just, it's, I've always wondered that. I've always wondered, are there just some birds that don't gobble? And if they do, they only do it before hunting starts. Do they change? We know they do. We know that gobbling activity decreases after hunting starts unless the level of hunting pressure is very, very low. I mean, we've shown that over a number of studies. But is that decline in gobbling only certain toms? Right? Is that decline being driven by some birds going, you know what, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore, or is it most of the birds are changing how they behave? That's some of the questions I'm really interested in. Is are there some birds that are just very, very different in how they call than others?
Well, I know one thing that you and I chatted about in the previous podcast too was just like, do turkeys do they essentially gobble less now because
Mm-hmm.
through
Mm-hmm.
selective harvest of turkeys that have a propensity to gobble?
Yep. Yeah, and we actually recently published a paper showing that toms that move a certain distance, that behave a certain way, are disproportionately harvested. And so the question then becomes, are those traits, the way that birds move, is that heritable, right? Can that be passed from one generation to the next? And we don't know the answer to this in turkeys, but in many other species, the answer is yes. There is solid research showing that some movements are heritable, that how you move is something that can be, inherited. Don't know for turkeys, but it is an interesting question to pose. Is, to your point, is, well, are we selecting against or selecting for certain types of behaviors, and is gobbling one of those? Are we harvesting, disproportionately harvesting the ones that yap their mouth all the time? And my logical suspicion is yes. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I hear two birds and one of them is ripping his head off and one gobbled one time and I haven't heard him since, I'm going to the talker.
Right.
Uh, and I think most of us would probably do the same thing. Now, does that matter from, across 10 generations? We don't know, but it is interesting.
Yeah. Or is that just, the specific mood of both of those birds at that point in time? The one that you didn't go after 2 hours later, maybe he's gobbling his head off.
Exactly. You just don't know. Yeah.
What you mentioned something earlier talking about the research and the data that we do have, and having a fairly concrete idea of, if we do this, then this happens. Are there some things that you can point to, and this might be more for the person who has a piece of private ground that they can, manage and have the freedom to work, versus public land? I mean, I guess the information is good for state agencies as well that can manage the public lands. But are there things that a person can do that, yeah, if you do this, this, and this, you're likely going to have more turkeys on your place?
Yeah, I mean, the big one from my own research that sticks out is fire. I mean, down here in the South, prescribed fire is a critically important management tool for turkey managers. Not, don't think wildfire, right? Not catastrophic wildfire, but prescribed understory vegetation burns, low intensity used to manage vegetation where turkeys stand, right? At their head height. We have shown very clearly using the GPS data that if you burn at a certain time, turkeys are going to be back in that stand within X number of days. If you burn in a certain month, they are X times more likely to use that stand than if you burned in a different month. If you burn a certain size piece of forest, they are more or less likely to use it than if you did something else. So, and I'm not just the only one doing this. There's some other research projects that are looking at um, some restoration practices. So, for instance, we have some work on Rio Grande's showing that I don't know if you've been out in Texas and some of the areas that where you've got cedar encroachment that's really really bad, um, to the point where it creates non-usable space. Turkeys just can't walk into it. They can't move in it, so they avoid it. And there's very clear research showing that if you go in and you remove cedar at this level, this is how turkeys respond. If you remove it at this level, which is higher, this is how they respond. This is what it takes to get them to come back to that piece of property. So there are a number of examples of to your question of if you do this, this is what you should expect to see. Um, the problem is getting that information out there for people to be aware of it. Um, and that's something that people like me have done a fairly poor job at for many years. but but we're trying to do better, and forums like this podcast, offer people the opportunity to say, well, okay, well, now where do I go find that information? Which may be a good segue into what I know you wanted to talk about, the wild turkey lab. But um, now with the social media platforms that are available, and YouTube and all these, these platforms where you can share information and you can share content, there there is no excuse for people like me to not be able to show landowners and hunters this information, to show them with, where they can see it with their own eyes. So for instance, you hear this all the time, well, we need more brood habitat. Well, what does that look like? Like, well, what does brood habitat look like? And does it look the same in Georgia as it does in Texas, or in Montana or in Nebraska? And the answer is yes and no. It doesn't look the same from our perspective because all those landscapes are the same. But if you get down on a hen's level, it all looks the same. It's very, very similar from one landscape to the next. But until people can see that, it's very difficult to just listen to somebody on a podcast, or watch a presentation on YouTube and say, well, we need more brood habitat, and here's a slide of what that looks like. It's much more powerful if you can show someone right there on the screen, this is why this is brood habitat. So I need you to look at the landscape like a turkey, and here's how you need to do that. And if you do that, you can go anywhere in North America and assess on your own whether that's brood habitat with your own eyes. But until we can show people what that looks like, it's an abstract concept, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you transitioned into my very next question. For a person who is interested in your research, finding out more, the brood habitat thing is the perfect thing. Where can they go to find that information?
Yeah, so this is an effort that's been growing, and it's now it's gotten to the point now where we can do what we've ultimately wanted to do. And what I mean by that is, a couple of years ago, I launched the Wild Turkey Lab website. And my goal originally, to be honest, was just I wanted to archive the work that I have done in my career to serve so that there would be a repository for all of that information, whether it's the research papers that we've published through the years, the social media posts that have been made, the articles that I've written, the podcasts that I've appeared on. At first, it was just, I want there to be a permanent archive of that, because when I step away, I want that to be available to somebody when I retire and I'm out of this field. But man, it's really evolved since then. Once we started adding the content, and I took a step back from my own career and started thinking more, a little bigger picture about this bird and the issues that it faces. I realized that a more powerful tool would be to use this website to do that, what I just described, but also to provide historical content for people, such as works that have things that were done 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30, whatever it is, and to make those resources available to people, and more importantly, to explain in layman's terms what it means and why you should care. I decided that I wanted to use the website to publicize people that walked in the path that I'm walking now decades before me, the pioneers that laid the foundation for turkey's science and management. And so we launched it's called the Spurred series last spring, where we highlighted R. Wayne Bailey, who was a kind of the father of turkey restoration in a lot of ways. This spring, I'll be highlighting Lovett Williams, who was a famous researcher, probably the most famous researcher that's ever walked the earth for wild turkeys, published dozens and dozens of things, and explained to people what Lovett did with his career and why you should care and how important it has been to me being able to do my job. And then lastly, which is where I was headed with this, I said, what I really need to do is I need to film content, short, very short film content, to show people what I'm talking about in real time. So in other words, I can explain to you for an hour what brood habitat is, but if I went to 10 different places in North America and showed you in 30 seconds what it looks like, then it would resonate with you much more, and it would be much more impactful. And so this spring we are filming, I'm filming all over North America, and we are going to start uploading that type of content to the site to provide people with a visual of you know, what this bird thrives in. And even beyond that, for instance, very simple things. How do you age a wild turkey? Well, I'm going to show you in 30 seconds. Here's how you do it. How do you, have you ever examined crop contents of a turkey, and what would that tell you? I mean, you think literally any subject you want to think about is in my head as to what could I show people that would, one, give them information that they would find valuable, two, information that would resonate with them and would be something they would talk to somebody else about, that they would pass along to someone else that would then benefit from the information. And can I do it in a way that's impactful and resonates with people? And as you can't get in the weeds too much with people. There's a certain type of person that listens to podcasts like this, and they're okay listening to me talk for an hour and a half. But there's a lot of people in our society that are not willing to do that, but they are willing to watch 60 seconds of a video. And what I want to do with the Wild Turkey Lab is I want to connect with all of those people. I want to connect with the podcast listeners, the research geeks, the Instagram people that follow me, and I want to start showing not just the information that I do, collect, and the research I do, but what others have done, and allow that website and that resource to grow.
No, I mean, that sounds great. And it sounds like you've got a diverse suite of content that you've created so far and going to continue to curate there. But, different types of content, have different, they either appeal to different people in different ways, but oftentimes they have a different job, right? Like you said, like this podcast is great. You're in the car, and you want to learn about the wild turkey, man, let's go, But, and I know, and for myself, it's like when I'm looking for like an answer on something and I see that there's a 30-minute video and somewhere within that video lies the answer I'm searching for, I go to, like you said, the 30-second or minute video that's like, this is the question, this is the answer. Now, go on.
Exactly. I just did this the other day on YouTube. I was trying to fix something. I searched, and there was one that was 6 minutes, 9 minutes, and all of a sudden I got down to one that was a minute and like 14 seconds. And I scrolled down really quick. Look, the reviews were excellent. The comments were excellent. Boom. I clicked on that one. And in a minute, in what it was, 14 seconds or whatever it was, I had my answer. I walked out in the garage, I fixed it, and I was done.
Right.
And that's literally the model that I want to use. Not in all cases, but a lot of the things that we talk about in the turkey hunting management community can literally be demonstrated in 60 seconds. Obviously, I see real value in a place for longer format, video and film, but for just trying to show somebody this is what it looks like, and here's why it looks like that, and here's why the bird is here, or whatever the scenario is. This is what you're looking at. Here's why you should care. This is what it looks like. They get a visual and they're done.
Yeah.
That's what I want to do with that part of the Wild Turkey Lab.
I love it. Well, and speaking of content, Mike, we did a really cool film with you, on the wild turkey, and really, a lot of stuff that we're talking about today. But man, I got a chance to watch it the other day, and it's just, it's shot so well, and great cinematography, and you narrate it so well, and it's got turkey conservation and some turkey hunting in there, and it's just a really great film that I feel that exemplifies a lot of what we've talked about today. So I do want to point folks to the Vortex Nation YouTube channel where they can watch that and see you talk about some of the things that we talked about today.
Yeah, for sure. And that was a really cool opportunity, like you and I talked about before we started taping it. That was really, I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed spending time with the filmmaker, and it worked out that we killed a bird in a really challenging hunt. That was a tough hunt. I didn't know what to expect when I agreed to do that opportunity, and it was tough, man. We got our butts kicked for a few days. That there were very few birds in that area that were not being hunted or had not been hunted, and so we struggled to get birds, to find birds to hunt, and to be honest with you, Mark, that struggle, and Thomas and I agreed when we were filming that struggle kind of galvanized the conversation that we had, because some of the issues that we've talked about here, we talked about while we were hunting, while we were walking, while we were driving, and the fact that we struggled so mightily to find a bird that would gobble and play with us, and it took all morning for us to kill that bird. That really galvanized some of the conversations that we had and that appear in that film. And it really brought it it made the issues facing the bird kind of front and center. And it made it very easy to discuss it, because we had just gotten our tails kicked for 4 or 5 days. Yeah. So,
realistically, the topic that you're speaking to, you're congruently living it while.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was cool. I hunted in the Northeast, and I hadn't spent much time up there, and that was a really cool experience. My wife went with me, and of course she didn't hunt, but we rented a little house on the side of a mountain, and we enjoyed ourselves, and being able to kill a bird was just kind of icing on the cake.
I love it. Mike, if we can, I'd love to end. I mean, not that this conversation has been negative, but man, are there some positive things, some bright spots? I feel like we did chat about a few of them along the way here, or regions of the state that are. I mean, turkey populations are on the rise. Like, what's anything going on that we're seeing the trend go the other way?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And we talked a little bit about that. I mean, I don't think, I mean, the data are very clear. There are states that are starting to see populations that had declined now increase again. And that is really cool. And like I said earlier, I hope those trends continue. We know we're not heading back where we were 20 years ago, but boy, if we could increase populations by, 25% or 30, whatever, you pick a percentage, but if we could grow our populations in these areas that have witnessed declines, and then more importantly, figure out a way to stabilize them, then the future's bright. And there are data sets across a number of states showing that's now ongoing. And that is encouraging.
That's super encouraging. Anything we missed along the way, or anything I didn't ask about, or did we touch on most of it?
I think we covered everything. I would just say, if anybody that listens wants to contact me, you can obviously reach out to me on social media, whether it's X or Instagram or Facebook. My handle on X and Instagram is Wild Turkey Doc, all one word. On Facebook, if you just search on my name, you'll find me. If that doesn't work and you're not a social media person, if you have email, shoot me an email. If you go to the University of Georgia's website and just search on my name, you'll see my email address. And you can also, if you're interested in the content that's on the Wild Turkey Lab, if you go to wildturkeylab.com, you'll see a pile of content. Like I mentioned, that will be growing exponentially this year, which is something I'm really excited and proud of.
Very cool. Nope, that's all great stuff, Mike. Man, I can't thank you enough for sitting down with us again. It's always a pleasure chatting with you. I always learn a ton, and it always reinvigorates my passion for turkeys and turkey conservation, and just incredibly insightful. So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you for the work that you've done throughout your career. My goodness, more than 30 years of turkey research. I mean, that is something to be proud of, and I know there's a lot of folks out there, including myself, that appreciate you for it.
Absolutely. Glad to do it.
Awesome.
Glad to do it.
Awesome. All right. Well, that will wrap up this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Man, if you're interested in learning more about this, like Mike said, give them a shout, reach out to them, check out the content that they have on the Wild Turkey Lab. Sounds like they've got a lot of great content upcoming. Check out the film that we did with Mike on the Vortex Nation YouTube channel. That's part of our Vortex Hunt series. And until next time, we'll catch you on the next one. Bye, everybody.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.